Thank you, Giuseppe. Thank you, Angela, for this presentation, for the opportunity of being here, and thank you also to the organization for letting possible this very awaited conference. We'll start with a quote. A book was a commodity like jewels, gloves, handkerchiefs, rosaries, pepper, or any other luxury product. It was not a commodity like meat, beans, wine, and other products that everyone needs to buy just in order to live. This is how book historians usually describe the nature of books as commodities. The book is a product that, in contrast to food, fuel, or housing, can be missed. In times of shortage, prices of grains go up as a result of the imbalance between offer and demand. This point was dramatically made in 1585 and 1586, when the southern Netherlands were haunted by extremely wet summers and, as a consequence, very poor harvests. As a result, prices spiked as never before, and common people had no other choice than to postpone or drop unnecessary expenses. In contrast, prices of luxury goods remained relatively stable, as they did not experience shocks in supply or demand. Buyers of luxury products usually do not suffer as much as common people under inflation, decrease in wages, or rocketing food prices. In this paper, we focus on the following questions. First, how did average book prices change over time at the Officina Plantiniana in Antwerp in the period 1581 and 1655? Second, how do book prices relate to people's fluctuating income, their wages, and rent? Third, how did book prices fixed by the famous Antwerp booksellers compare to prices of their competitors elsewhere in Europe? This will help to understand the status of the books produced by the famous Officina Plantiniana during the last years of its founder, Christopher Plantin, and the business operation directed by his successors after July 1589, and help to put in a broader international perspective. In the first part, we will discuss how we assess income, wages, rent, and book prices. Then we will compare trends between income and book prices, and this will be followed by a comparison with book prices of book produced in the German-speaking region for sale at the Frankfurt book fairs. We will conclude with a discussion and further research questions. So about the methodology, the idea is to verify whether the prices of the books produced by the Officina Plantiniana, or rather their trend over time, follows or diverges from those of a general price index, represented by a basket of goods measuring the average consumption of the population of the Brabant area. And from that, of another sui generis, but still representative commodity, as the average rents of houses in Antwerp. Those prices will be related to the nominal and real wages of two categories of workers belonging to a lower middle layer of the population. In any case, not to the cultural and economic elite. Compositors active at the Officina and master masons. For the creation of the price index, we relied on the data proposed by John Munro, obtained by processing the basket of consumables offered by Herman van der Vee in a paper he wrote some decades ago. Van der Vee observed the behavior of prices in the Brabant region of Antwerp, Leer, Mechelen for the 3 centuries, 1400-1700, thus covering the entire price revolution era along with the preceding century. The present analysis covers the period 1581-1655. As we will explain later, the time span for the second part of our analysis, which includes German books, is limited to the years 1586-1631. The set of goods considered by Van der Vee includes a combination of food products such as farinaceous grains, drinks, barley, malt, meat, fish, dairy products, butter and cheese, and industrial products, including fuel, light, like charcoal, candles, lamp oil, and textiles, like linen, canvas, coarse woolens. A remarkably positive element of this index, the index proposed by Munro based on the Van der Vee data, is that its components do not have fixed shares of the total basket. The proportion accounted for each commodity group vary over time, with changes in relative prices, and the major variation involves grain prices. This is important for at least two reasons. First, grain represented a large part of the entire consumption basket, especially for the lower middle classes of the population. Second, grain prices frequently experience severe fluctuations. For example, during prolonged periods of population growth and presumed diminishing returns in agricultural production, the relative price of grains usually rose more than did those of animal products, which in turn rose considerably more than did the prices of labor-intensive industrial products. As food prices rose, most lower-income households would have been forced to spend their largest share of the budget first on bread grains, then on drink, and somewhat less on meat, fish, and dairy products. Industrial goods, on the other hand, would usually have ranked last in importance in the household budget, because, with the exception of fuel, most such expenditures could have been postponed. Consequently, consumer demand for most such products would have risen less than would demand for foodstuff, and that would have been reflected in the corresponding behavior of relative consumer price. Conversely, during prolonged periods of population decline, especially with the absence of any inflationary factors, such as coinage debasement or disruption from welfare or other supply shocks, grain prices tended to fall and fell more so than did other commodity prices, accounting for a smaller share of the basket. The construction of this index in sum, aims to better reflecting the historical reality of the consumer expenditures. The price index calculated in this way, compiled for 5 yearly intervals and adapted by us to take as a basis the period 1581-1585, was then used both to compare the trend of the book price index and to deflate the nominal wage of the two categories of workers identified according to the standard formula, real wage index equal to the nominal money wage index divided by the consumer price index. Should be noted that the wage index provided by Munro for the master masons has been adapted by him to reflect the trend of seasonal work. As for the composer's wage index, it has been obtained from the data of 63 workers active at the Officina over several years during the period covered by our analysis. Finally, the index of rents had been derived from the one elaborated by scholars to which we refer to further details, and modified so as to have the 5-year period 1581-1585 as a basis.
A book is never just a book. There are books of all kinds on different subjects, in different formats, in different languages, and geared at different audiences. And some of these features have impacts on the price of books, as has been demonstrated by Angela also for Venice, such as the bibliographical format, the use of specific types, and the use of second color. Also, the presence of illustrations in relief or in intaglio, or the use of specific paper stocks, such as very thick or very large paper, weigh in on prices. For the purpose of this paper, we analyzed 2 different archival sources. First, we focused on ideal retail prices fixed by Christophe Plantin and his successors in the period 1581-1655, as recorded in this manuscript M321 at the Museum Plantin Moretus in Antwerp. This is a dynamic production list of titles with prices for the book trade starting in 1580, running down to 1655. And it contains about 2,300 entries of editions. Second, we analyzed purchases by the Antwerp company at the Frankfurt Fair in the period 1586 until 1631, in order to understand price levels of books produced in the German-speaking region. Prices in both sources are expressed in Carolus guilders, the account money usually used by the Officina Plantiniana for earnings and expenses. They always pertain to first-hand, unbound books, that is in albis, thus avoiding the difficulties related with bindings and other types of finishing. The production list allows for comparisons of pricing strategies of the last 9 years under Plantin and under his 3 successors. In order to make comparisons across prices of all kinds of books possible, we also recalculated the price per copy to price per printing sheet. By doing so, we obtain a stable price per unit across varying sizes of books. Then we recalculated all quinquennial averages as an index, taking the period 1581-1585 as a base, which allows for a comparison with the Antwerp price index wages and rents. The analysis of the Cahiers de Francfort for the Frankfurt Book Fair is more complicated. A brief description of the source may explain this. Twice a year, someone from the Officina Plantiniana traveled to Frankfurt to the Frankfurt book fairs. And at those fairs, the Officina sold books to and bought books from local and international book dealers. Sales and purchases were recorded in notebooks, the so-called Cahiers de Francfort, which you can see on the screen. Typically, sales to a bookseller were listed on the left-hand side of a double page and purchases on the right-hand side. Entries usually mentioned very brief titles, the number of copies involved, often bibliographical formats, sometimes the price per copy, and total prices for the total number of copies sold or bought. First, we transcribed purchases at 8 September fairs between 1586 and 1631, which resulted in about 3,200 entries. And of that data set, we could only use about 10% for this paper because that 10% pertains to books published in the German-speaking countries in that period. We focused on that subset of books because online bibliographies of the 16th and 17th century books from the German-speaking region provide detailed collations, pagination statements, and bibliographical formats, allowing the calculation of printing sheets per copy and hence prices per sheet. Over to the results. The first graph indicates the evolution of the price index of an average basket of consumables in the periods of 5 years, taking the period 1581-85 as a base of our index, so that is 100%. And since the index is based on the period just before the fall of Antwerp, it reflects the immediate effects of this disruptive event in the period which follows immediately. The surge of prices is also caused by very bad harvests in the years 1585 and 86, and by the progressive devaluation of local currencies. And by the beginning of the 17th century, price levels are back to normal and stay at the original level during the peaceful years of the so-called truce. By the end of the truce is again marked by a sudden rise in price levels until 1630. Prices rise again from 1636 onwards, be it at a slower pace, and drop again at the last period of our survey. The next graph compares the price index that we've just seen with the real wages of master masons and of compositors active at the Officina Plantiniana. And it shows that nominal wages are not being compensated for the sudden rise of prices after the fall of Antwerp at the end of the 16th century. In the period 1601-1620, masons, masters, and compositors at the Officina enjoyed better times, as their income must have allowed some extra purchase power. This changes dramatically after 1621. Incomes then go down while prices go up, and as a result, people impoverished considerably for about 35 years. Remarkably, the compositors at the Officina Plantiniana systematically earned more than masons masters from the 1610s onwards, and must have suffered less from diverging prices and incomes. This graph shows the evolution of rents in this period compared to wages. Because of the massive depopulation after of the city after the fall of Antwerp, which you can see on this graph, rents plummeted in the following years to increase again from the beginning of the 17th century until the end of the truce, after which they dropped again. Interestingly, rents levels are systematically paralleled by levels of wages, and it confirms, once again, how compositors were always better off than masons' masters. Let's now compare book prices of the Officina in this period. This graph compares the evolution of the price index with the average nominal retail price per sheet of new unbound books. And remarkably, it reflects a steep increase of book prices, diverging from the price index from the period 1591-1595 onwards, probably not by coincidence the period when Jan Moretus I takes over the business of his father-in-law. The following graph does not only confirm this growing divergence between prices, wages, and rents, expressed in real terms, that is deflated using the general price index. Book prices at the Officina evolve in a sovereign way, as they detach completely from evolutions in prices, wages, and commodities like housing, for instance. These findings do not only confirm what we already knew about the direction taken by the firm, but also put it in a wider perspective. The comparison with living standards of common people allow for a more articulated interpretation of the book prices the Officina Plantiniana established. Other studies about the Officina have indeed demonstrated that Jan Moretus I and later generations gradually moved towards the production of more expensive book formats, both large and also the very small formats. Second, that they diminished the share of woodcut illustrations in favor of more beautiful and also more expensive intaglio illustrations, copper plates. Third, that they produced more than before special runs of editions on luxury paper. And fourth, that they systematically focused more and more exclusively on liturgical books printed in black and red, which, as they were in Latin, could be catered to a local and international market. And all these elements match well with the specific target publics of well-to-do individual and institutional customers who did not suffer from inflation, debased currencies, rising prices, or dropping wages. More than ever, by the mid-17th century, the Officina Plantiniana had moved to the upper strata of the book market. Let's now have a look at a sample of the editions from German-speaking countries. It shows the average price per sheet for every 5 years according to the publication date of the books. The information for both Antwerp books and German books on this graph is given here in nominal figures. The next graph holds exactly the same information for Antwerp and German books, but now the data is recalculated in real terms. The line which averages for German books show quite some spikes, and this is due to the limited size of the data set, which has for a few intervals rather weak numbers. The spread between the price per sheet in the beginning of the period is fairly big. The average price per sheet which Plantin is selling is about 37% higher than those of the books he buys in Frankfurt. And in the course of the following 60 years, the difference between the two diminishes a little bit, and in the period 1631-1640, books produced by the Officina Plantiniana are still on average 17% more expensive. This comparison seems to indicate that the price per sheet of editions produced in German-speaking countries were on average significantly cheaper than those produced by Plantin. And this seems also to indicate that Plantin and his successors focused on richer audiences than their international competitors. But we have to remain cautious not to jump into conclusions. One of the unsolved questions which springs from this comparison is to what extent the purchases of the Officina are representative for the market at large or not. It could be that Plantin's successors increasingly and systematically selected books for the higher luxury market to match their own high-end products from those from abroad.
So to sum up and to draw some conclusions, the method offers clean insight in general price trends and wages compared to the prices of books. Prices of books published by the Officina Plantiniana evolve in ways that they are no longer related to the average trend of prices or the evolution of wages. If regular books are already to be labeled as luxury commodities, then books from the Officina Plantiniana are to be considered luxury object to the power. Once again, this survey shows that the Officina Plantiniana occupied a specific place in the market, and the trends shown in the business records do not necessarily reflect strategies of other printers, publishers, and that their pricing strategy was probably not the norm for other businesses. It is clear that book prices from the Officina Plantiniana cannot serve as good proxy for book prices in general, as they are not targeting typical customers from the middle class. Future research should try to define common books and study their prices. It is very likely that other publishing firms developed other pricing strategies to meet the demands of common and local publics in need for, amongst other, almanacs, prayer books, and school books. Thank you.